Nothing in this world looked wrong. No cities burned, no armies marched, and no one was ever forced to answer. And that was the problem, because while the world remained at peace, something else continued, quietly. Through offices lit long after midnight, nothing hidden, nothing secret, just accepted. Until one day, people started asking questions.
By the time the truth surfaced, it was too late to prosecute it. 1974. 5 European governments suspended diplomatic relations within 48 hours. Alliances fractured, embassies emptied, intelligence channels went silent. Not because of invasion, not because of war, but because a cache of documents surfaced. Documents dated as early as 1939 and as late as 1972. They contained transport authorizations, citizenship reclassification orders, and labor registries, all maintained across decades, properly filed, properly signed. The language used was lawful. The outcome violated something deeper. There had been no world war, no occupation, no tribunals, yet entire populations were reclassified without crossing a single legal boundary. The documents raised a question no government could answer. Had the policies ever ended, or had they simply evolved? No one waited for the answer. Markets froze. Trading halted across multiple exchanges before official statements were released. Bond yields spiked. Currency markets swung violently. Borders tightened. Emergency powers were activated. Cabinets convened through the night. And for the first time in a generation, the war that never happened was finally felt. Not on battlefields, in balance sheets, in border stations, in ministries that suddenly realized they had inherited something no one had dismantled. This archive was sealed for instability, not because violence erupted, but because reckoning had never occurred. The paper trail did not begin in 1974. It began much earlier, September 1939. In our world, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The century fractured. In this timeline, the order was prepared and never delivered. The reasons remained disputed, but the consequences were not. The paper trail did not reveal a sudden atrocity. It revealed its continuity, and continuity does not trigger alarms. It does not activate emergency powers or summon tribunals. It persists under routine authorization. In our world, war forced ideology into the open. It shattered illusions and dragged systems into daylight. In this one, war never came. Nothing burned, nothing confessed, nothing was forced into exposure. The regimes did not collapse. They adapted. Emergency decrees expired, but the registries did not. Detention systems were reduced, but reclassification statutes endured. The language softened. The categories did not. Global depression dragged on. Factories slowed, but never transformed. Unemployment stopped being a crisis. It became a condition. Without wartime production, there was no surge to absorb labor. Without coordinated rebuilding, there was no shared recovery. There was no United Nations, no NATO, no alliance structure designed to prevent escalation. There was no shared legal doctrine prepared in advance. The phrase crimes against humanity was never written, because no rupture had forced consensus. Without global war, there was no global witnessing. Without witnessing, there was no shared vocabulary. Without vocabulary, there was no indictment. The system did not end, it adjusted, and systems that adjust without reckoning do not disappear. They refine, and refinement is quieter than collapse. At first, the narrowing of citizenship was described as stabilization. Later, it was framed as efficiency. Eventually, it was presented as cultural preservation. Each revision reduced urgency. Each revision increased permanence. The language grew calmer. The categories did not. Courts adapted, employers adapted, administrations adapted, and what a society adapts to long enough becomes ordinary. Over time, the language crossed borders, not copied, adopted. Trade agreements referenced citizenship review. Labor statutes introduced eligibility suspensions. Emergency clauses allowed status clarification during instability. Different governments, different histories, similar phrasing. They weren't identical systems. They didn't need to be. They aligned. It wasn't conspiracy. It was convergence. And convergence spreads quietly through paperwork, through revisions, through forms no one reads twice. By the early 1970s, terminology in 5 capitals had begun to resemble one another closely enough to be indistinguishable in translation. Economic strain intensified. Supply chains grew brittle. Currency swings triggered domestic panic. In 1971, a regional conflict ignited along a disputed border. There was no NATO framework to contain it, no UN chamber to mediate it, no emergency doctrine to stabilize it. Markets reacted before diplomats could. Energy shipments stalled, industrial output dipped, governments turned inward, and coordination thinned. Trust weakened. Then, in 1974, the documents surfaced. At first, they appeared administrative. Transfer logs, classification records, reassignment forms. But deeper in the archives were budget allocations that never terminated, procurement contracts that renewed quietly, maintenance expenditures for facilities officially listed as decommissioned. Staffing rosters were restructured, but never dissolved. The registries were not archival. They were active. The reclassification statutes had not expired. They had been amended, quietly, incrementally, legally. And within decades of technical revision lay the detail that fractured 5 governments in 48 hours. The camps were never dismantled. They were renamed, first as transitional labor centers, then as regional processing authorities, later as provisional housing administrations. The language evolved, the function did not. Students gathered first, then labor unions, then internal auditors who began recognizing their own signatures on renewal forms they had processed for years. Judges hesitated, not because the documents were unclear, but because no statute existed to prosecute something that had been maintained legally. Ministries emphasized compliance and continuity. No one explained why the facilities had never been fully dismantled. Trust fractured. Governments defended legality. The public questioned legitimacy. Authority fractured, not under attack, but under exposure. The unrest did not escalate into civil war. It hardened into paralysis. Emergency powers were invoked to preserve order, but order requires legitimacy. What surfaced was not a crime newly discovered. It was a system long maintained. Peace had prevented destruction. It had also preserved machinery no one had been forced to dismantle. What collapsed was not the state. It was its claim to moral boundary. Authority failed under examination, and once exposed, it could not be restored. Archive 783A is sealed. Additional records remain classified. One of them documents a different failure. In that timeline, the First World War never came. Tension accumulated across generations. Rivalries hardened. Systems calcified. When rupture finally arrived, it was uncontrollable. That record is designated 778-B. In this one, the Second War never came. In that one, the First War never came. Both worlds survived longer than expected. Both fractured under weight they refused to confront. If you believe peace guarantees stability, review Archive 778-B. The pattern repeats. Subscribe to remain notified when the next file is opened. Processing complete.